Hi there, Sue Stockdale here, and welcome to episode 141 of the Access to Inspiration podcast. My guest today is German philosopher Dr. Christoph Quarch, the first philosopher we've had on the podcast. I was curious to understand from Christoph what philosophy is and why it's relevant to all of us today. We discuss the importance of meaningful conversation as a way of individually and collectively transforming, and why, as ever, there is a need for slowing down, reconnecting with nature and embracing open-mindedness for all of us to live a more fulfilling life. If you want to follow along with the transcription, go on over to our website, accesstoinspiration.org. Welcome to the podcast, Christoph Quarch. How are you today?
Oh, I'm very fine. Thank you, Sue. I'm happy to be with you.
And have I pronounced your name correctly?
You did, and you can be very proud on you because not everybody succeeds at the first time.
Oh, well, that's good. We're off to a good start then. Now, this is the first time I've spoken on the podcast to a philosopher, so I am going to be very curious to find out from you today what your work and your life involves, Christoph. Philosophy can seem abstract or distant to many people today. How do you define what philosophy is, first of all?
Yes, and it is a tough place as well because asking 100 different philosophers, you will receive 100 different answers what philosophy is. But however, here comes my own definition. I think philosophy is mostly about analyzing and deciphering our current mindset, or you can say each of us, we usually have thought patterns. We behave and think in a way that is somehow defined by a mental paradigm that we inherited by our socialization, by our culture, by our civilization. You can also put it like this. There's a kind of operational system which is working on our brain, on our mind, and we hardly ever reflect it. But nevertheless, it has a huge impact on us because it defines all our patterns and all our modes of how we see the world, how we look into the world. And what philosophy actually does is to try to analyze its mindset, to criticize it, and to reconstruct its generation. In our case, in the 21st century, for instance, we have a mindset which was generated at the end of the 16th century in the period of the confessional wars in Central Europe and also in England. And that means that the way we think today is by no means fallen from heaven. It is not something which can't be altered. It is something that has its own history. The history can be reconstructed. And that means, however, that change is always possible. And I suppose we actually are in a situation in our world where transformation is urgently required. And I think it can be very helpful to understand why we behave the way we do and where are alternatives. For instance, other things that philosophers do is they reconstruct the mindset of different cultures, for instance, of the ancient Greek culture, which is my specialty, my field of research. And it is pretty fascinating to see that these ancient Greeks, that they thought in different ways, that they behaved in different ways. They constructed a different culture, which is somehow related to ours, but on the other hand, it's completely different. And that's something which is very inspiring and which can be an inspiration for modern people as well.
I'm now fascinated, Christoph, because with that definition, you've connected to me with my coach hat on. When I'm working with a leader, I'm also trying to help them to understand their thinking patterns and their mindsets. Now, I never would have connected that to this sense of philosophy that you're describing. And of course, I'm not a philosopher.
Perhaps you are.
What I'm hearing in both contexts is about raising awareness and the capacity for transformation.
Yes, I mean, there are different patterns. What coaches or psychologists usually do is that they try to analyze the psychological patterns, which are very important for our individual behavior as well. Philosophers do this to a certain degree as well, but me, for instance, I'm more focused on, let's say, collective social patterns of habits and of thoughts. For instance, when I work with executives or with leadership people, I do not focus that much on their psychological settings, but I try to create some awareness and some consciousness concerning the way that we actually organize economy in general, the metaphors we use to describe the function of corporations. And let's say the virtues and the values that leadership people usually make use of in order to orient themselves when executing their businesses. So there's a kind of mental or spiritual level in humans, and there's also a kind of psychological level. Both of them are pretty important. Philosophers, in comparison with psychologists or coaches, focus a bit more on that collective mental paradigms, as I put it, operational systems, because these are the blind spots in almost everybody. And we need to shed some light into that blind spots in order to come to, let's say, to enduring and sustainable transformations.
Wow, there's so many different directions we could take this conversation, Christoph. The one I would like to begin with is what initially drew you to philosophy. Because I don't imagine as a young child somebody wakes up one morning and decides they want to be a philosopher.
True, but actually, I really fall in love with philosophy in my teenage days. I think I was 15 or 16 years old when, by chance, I found in the library of my father a tiny book which was called Plato's Master Dialogues. And I opened the book and I read some lines from Plato's dialogue Phaedo. I have to confess I hardly understood anything, but what I really understood is that this has got something to do with me. I felt addressed by the words I read, and I was somehow attracted. And yes, you can really put it like this. And this is a Greek concept, however, a kind of erotic fire was lit in my heart. And I wanted to understand more. I wanted to learn more about the culture that these old texts derives from. And therefore, after having finished with high school, I decided to study ancient Greek language and philosophy. But to be honest, then I had to do my civil service, as it was still obligatory in Germany in the 1980s. And during this 18 months, I had something I used to call my religious turn. And then I shifted my plans and started to study theology. But when studying theology, the first thing I had to do was learn ancient Greek. And when learning ancient Greek, I read Plato again, and I realized that my love hadn't died so far. And after only 1.5 years, I shifted from theology to philosophy. And then I met a pretty renowned German philosopher called Hans-Georg Gadamer, who was almost 90 years old when I became his assistant. And Gadamer was really a very fascinating figure because he was not, let's say, a sober academic, but he was someone who celebrated philosophy as a kind of lifestyle. He is the founder of philosophical hermeneutics, and dialogue has a very important role in that kind of philosophy. And Gadamer really practiced it. Whenever I went to him, he asked me questions. He asked me, "Oh, I know you're visiting a seminar of my colleague XY, and you are reading Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 1. So what do you think about line 11.7ba4? What is your kind of interpretation? What do you say to this?" And then I really felt honored and privileged to have a philosophical chat with one of the world famous German philosophers. And this was quite amazing for me. So I realized philosophy is more than merely an academic discipline. It is really a way of how to live. And as Gadamer was somehow vibrating, radiant person, I said, well, it would be a life project to follow this trace.
And given that opportunity to learn from the world famous philosopher, how did you then take that forwards to live in the way that you were experiencing?
This is not easy to answer because, first of all, I started an academic career like everybody else does. So I wrote my PhD thesis on Plato, Plato's Philosophy of Aliveness, it was called. And to come back to my biography, my academic career was interrupted because there was no chance to advance. And therefore, I left university and worked as a journalist for a couple of years. And it took me about 10 years until I decided to start a life as freelance philosopher, what I'm actually practicing until now. And mostly in the time of being a freelance philosopher, I realized that philosophy also impacts my way of doing business, my way of teaching, my way of collaborating with other people, my way of giving seminars. And what really becomes of utmost importance for me is what I call the philosophy of conversation. So one of the things I really learned on my philosophical path, so to say, is that, let's say, the most important steps in my life were not executed by making a plan, having an idea, defining my goals, and trying to find the proper means in order to reach these goals, but that all the important changes in my life, the new impulses were given to me by other people, sometimes even by text, but always by kind of conversation. And I understood that what is really required for inner development, for psychological growth, is a kind of receptiveness, the willingness to listen to what life offers to you and to dive deep into a conversation with life itself, with humans who you meet during your way. And that through this, I really understood that I have the chance to unfold the potential which was still slumbering within me. I think I would have never become a philosopher if I would have made a plan and if I would have said to me, well, I want to become professor at Harvard. I would have failed sooner or later. But through diving into that constant conversation with colleagues, with other people, with my wife, with my students, I found a path which was not always, let's say, straight ahead. And I took some deviation. But at the end of the day, I'm very happy that I learned to converse in the manner I described.
So conversation is at the heart of what has taken you to where you are now, Christoph. It sounds like it's been pivotal there.
Exactly.
Conversation is pivotal in a podcast as well. Can more people have more meaningful conversations? Because often conversations can be at a surface level and they may not be meaningful. What would be your approach to encourage people to have more meaningful dialogue?
Well, first of all, dialogue or meaningful dialogue is a cultural practice which needs to be trained and learned like any other cultural practice as well. Think about playing, think about learning an instrument, think about a language. You need to practice and you need to have some discipline. And sometimes there are even some rules which should be followed in order to play the game in a proper way. And the same is true for conversation. I think what I really complain is that usually, even in our schools, we are not trained in conversation. We think conversation is something that is so taken for granted, everybody knows how to do it. But in fact, we don't know how to do it. And what is even worse, whenever we switch on the television set and watch a kind of talk show in the TV, you will find something which looks like a conversation, but what actually is not a conversation, but it is a kind of battle. It is a kind of combat where people fight each other through words like weapons. They try not to convince by arguments, but by rhetorical means or techniques. And this brings me to another point. We sometimes think that conversation is about methodology or technical skills, but this is not the case. Conversation is far more about what the ancient philosophers called virtues. Virtues like mindfulness, virtues like patience, virtues like humbleness, virtues like the capacity to listen in a profound way. Usually we do not listen to the words that other people use, but we only hear what we want to hear. We only want our expectations to be fulfilled. But it is very difficult for most of us to be that open-hearted and open-minded that we really are capable of hearing something new, which might help us to unfold potentials within ourselves we probably don't even know about. But real conversations, this is something I learned by my Professor Gadamer, is led by nobody. It leads itself. It is a kind of a common or mutual monologue, a couple of people amongst each other. And these are qualities which are almost forgotten. And this is quite strange because we live in a world in which we can converse or communicate in ways that have never been there before. But it seems to me sometimes the more tools, instruments of communication we have, the less developed seems to be our capacity to converse in a good way. So what I want to say is what really matters is to train these virtues of conversation I just mentioned. And this is something which needs to take place not only in politics, but also in economy, also in our private lives. And I suppose there are lots of opportunities where we can do it. But what is really required is a kind of attentiveness and of mindfulness so that we start to converse in a better way.
Given that Plato and the ancient Greeks are of great interest to you, Christoph, how did they converse?
Well, mostly we can learn from Socrates. Socrates was a master of conversation and he invented a new kind of dialogue, which is called the Socratic dialogue. What Socrates did actually was asking questions, real questions, not rhetorical questions by which you already know the answer or by which you only want to be confirmed in your own opinion. No, what Socrates actually did was asking questions which helped people to reflect on their blind spots, on their thought patterns. And now we come back to our first point, to the thought patterns that they always took for granted, they never reflected on, which worked silently within their brains without having ever been reflected. And this is what Socrates actually did. And through this, he somehow opens the mind of humans so that new insights could be generated. Sometimes this was pretty tough for his conversational partners or his interlocutors because they had to understand that the way they used to think, probably the way they loved to think, somehow led them astray. It's fascinating to read these Platonic dialogues in which Socrates is presented as an interlocutor, to see how people completely get lost within their own thought lines or their trains of argumentation. They don't know what to say anymore. And this exactly is a creative moment in which a new insight, a new idea can literally be implanted in the mind of another person. And then, let's say, the constructive part of the dialogue begins. The first part is somehow destructive, or I would rather call it disruptive, as we used to say in technological language. But this disruptive mindset is something which is very valuable because it sometimes really has a healing quality. Just think of the way that we usually live. I mean, a lot of even physical problems occur through fixed habits we don't ever reflect and we take simply for granted. But through asking questions, through posing questions in a proper way, through opening the mind for new insights, really innovative things can happen. And this is what we can learn from Socrates, posing real questions. And this takes courage, however, because putting somebody into the question, questioning somebody else in his personality is something you need to be aware that people can be pretty reluctant with that and they try to avoid asking or questioning themselves. But it is helpful. And as we live in a time in which transformation is required, this is a proper way in order to initialize processes of mental transformation.
If you are enjoying this episode with Christoph, I'd recommend you listen to episode 37 with Samir Dua, where we talked about mastering self-leadership through critical conversations. We have more than 140 episodes now, ranging from business and sports to the arts and social change. Head on over to accesstoinspiration.org to discover them all. So given that dialogue and meaningful conversations are activities that people need to have, I'm wondering who hires you? If you are a freelance philosopher, who pays to work with you, Christoph?
I have different kinds of clients because my business portfolio has a broad spectrum. On the one hand, something I actually do is making philosophy journeys, and those clients who book a philosophy journey, well, these are people who are simply interested in having philosophical conversation. Mostly retired people who tell me, oh, all of my life I had to work and now I have the time to care for the things that really matters. Now I can dive deep into philosophy. I can read some ancient Greek texts and all that stuff. These are interested people which want to be, let's say, a bit more educated on these topics. The other thing is, let's say, business clients. And business clients I collaborate with usually people in leadership positions who are yearning for new ways of organizing corporations. Some people realize that even though there have been a lot of coaches in their businesses, real transformation hasn't taken place so far. And finally, they end up with a philosopher and ask me, well, probably it's about the way that we think. Probably we need a new language. Probably we need to reflect in a different way on our values and on our virtues. And then the philosopher comes in. And what I actually do is trying by conversation to find out what matters to these people. Is there something that you can call the spirit of a corporation, which somehow has concealed through history or through, let's say, through the daily routines? And what I try to do is to identify, let's call it the spirit of a corporation or the spirit of a leadership person, and to operationalize it by defining the values of the corporation, by developing the corporate cultures, by trying to find out what kind of language is required in order to transport or to operationalize the thoughts that people really care about. And well, this is where I come in. I do not have a lot of clients, but those that I actually do have are people who are really interested in transformation and in developing corporate cultures.
So you help them to uncover their blind spots.
This is part of it, exactly. It is part of it. But it's not only the blind spots. As I put, it's about spirit. And spirit, however, is a difficult word because sometimes it sounds a bit esoteric. But what I really mean is whenever a new corporation is generated in a startup business, for instance, there used to be a founder who is inspired by some ideas, by some visions. And this inspiration somehow trickles down into the matrix of the corporation. But then another generation starts. And usually it's a shift from generation one to generation two. This initial spirit gets lost. And with the spirit, the values get lost. And with the values, the motivational system becomes weaker and weaker. The inspiration is about to abandon. And that means in order to inspire the employees and the leadership in a proper way, it needs to refer to the unique spirit that made the corporation once grow and which can be reactivated so that transformation or innovation can really occur.
I love that you brought our conversation round to the subject of inspiration, given we are the Access to Inspiration podcast, Christoph. What did the ancient Greeks, what did they make of inspiration?
Oh, they made a big deal out of it. And inspiration had quite a different significance. I would even say it has the original significance because the word inspiration derives from inspiring. So the spirit comes in. It is about a spiritual dimension, which is indicated by the word inspiration. The ancient Greeks had a different term. Inspiration is derived from Latin. The Greeks had enthusiasm. En means in, enthusiasm means a God inside, to have a God inside, to have a kind of divine insight, something that has not been generated through our own willpowers, through our ambition or our intentions. But real inspiration in the Greek understanding of the word is something that comes from the exterior. For instance, the ancient artists were convinced that not they for themselves are the authors of the pieces of art they produce, but that it was the muse which inspired them, which sang through them and gave them the right words as an inspiration, which flew through them to the paper on which a poem was written. And I think this is something which, however, is expressed in a mythological language. But everybody knows these moments in which an idea comes to our mind and nobody can tell, well, I have done this. This is a product, let's say, is a result of my reflections. No, it comes to my mind. It is like being kissed by a muse. And this is something which is mostly forgotten in corporations because we have the technical mindset. We always think if we have the right methodology, if we have the right technique, if we use the right skills, well, things will work out. But truth is, and this brings me back to the topic of conversation, the best things in life are always given to us. We usually lack of the receptivity to take what is given to us by colleagues, given to us by the market, given to us by politics. There are so many things that have impact on us, but we usually don't honor them because we always think it's up to us to do the things with our own willpower, with our knowledge, with our skills. We think that we are the masters of the universe, but truth is, through this, usually we step on the same spot and don't advance on our way. So what I want to say is inspiration is very important because when you are inspired by something and you are enthusiastic about it, you can share your enthusiasm and it will somehow trickle down into the corporation. And when your employees are enthusiastic, which is a bit more than inspired, when they are passionate about an idea, passionate about a vision that you share with them, well, then real transformation will take place, then innovation will take place. Because one thing is, in my opinion, this is really for sure. When you look into history, whenever real change took place, it was initiated by enthusiastic people, by people being inspired by a vision that was given to them, which they share and which stimulates their actions.
Wow, I think you've very succinctly described what we attempted to embody when we started up this podcast 4 years ago, Christoph, that by finding the passion in the guests, that will seep through in the listener's mind and help to inform their thinking or inspire them. So I'm also just wondering in that there's this sense of dialogue with something greater than oneself when we are being inspired, just the same as the dialogue that you were talking about earlier with other human beings.
Yes, indeed. That's exactly what I think. When we have a real deep conversation, we have the chance to get connected with a dimension of human existence, which is usually neglected in our modern world. And it is the dimension I call the spiritual dimension. Spirit is something amazing. The spirit pops up somehow whenever in a conversation we come to the point that we think we understand each other. And mostly when we understand each other on a level that we didn't know before, when we are desperately searching for a solution, for the right answer, and nobody of me or you has it. But by posing questions, by trying to give answers, by re-questioning these answers, slowly but surely you make, let's say, a mental movement And at the end of the day, you reach a point when you say, we got it. Now we understand each other. Now we find each other, let's say, on a level we haven't been before, but something is clarified. It's like a kind of epiphany. You can describe this by a religious vocabulary. It is like a revelation. Something brand new has popped up. And this is exactly what the ancients were talking about when they spoke about enthusiasm, or about the muse which kisses somebody, something which is not produced neither by one interlocutor or by the other, but which has grown like a plant in the space in between the humans. And as a philosopher, I very much appreciate Martin Buber, who wrote a fantastic book called I and You. And he describes conversation as something which is happening neither inside one person or the other, but in this intermediate space between two people. And he says this intermediate space, it is like a kind of greenhouse. New thoughts like plants can grow and which are nurtured and watered by the contributions of the speakers. But what I want to say is a conversational space is really something bigger. It is something that comprise different people and which through conversation not only connects them, but also opens a new common space which is shared by both of them. It is a bit difficult to talk about it, but using these metaphors probably or perhaps is helpful. But it is really something which brings us beyond the frontiers or beyond the limitations of our own individual subjective mindset. And this is something I would like to emphasize by this occasion, because what I really complain is mostly in the world of business and of corporations, that our whole behavior is very much subjectivity driven. It's, of course, a philosophical term, but it means we are focused on our volition, on our power, on our skills, on our tools. I think this mindset has come to an end. What to progress and to develop corporations and businesses and also societies is to realize that humans are not ego shooters who are driven by their own egocentric volition, but humans are social beings, social animals, so on politikon, a political, communicative being. This is what we are. And what I really understood is during my lifetime and in my philosophy is that only through conversations, through interactions, through collaboration, we can unfold our potentials, we can growth. That is the question is, what is good life? This is the main question of philosophers. And I think good life is something that we do not reach by fulfilling our desires, but by fulfilling our existence, by becoming what we really are, by becoming real human beings who interact both with other humans, with nature, and probably even with the divine.
So, how do you measure your success, Christoph?
I mean, the question, however, this is a typical philosophical answer, is what means success? I think there's a kind of personal success. My personal subjective success is when I have the impression that the people I converse with, or people who participated in one of my seminars or my philosophy journeys, or my clients, when at the end of the day they have a shining light in their eyes, when they are inspired, when there is a different energy level. You can't measure it by usual instruments. It is something on a more sophisticated level. And from my own personal approach, the degree of aliveness is what really matters. I don't think that being successful means to reach all the goals you have defined for your own subjective interests. I think that is not the case. I've met so many people who did exactly this. They made their career, they accumulated monetary wealth, they reached everything they wanted, but there's still a kind of void within their souls and within their minds. And when you talk to these people, you have the impression that they didn't really develop, that they haven't grown. That's something I love about the ancient Greeks. For them, the idea of good human life was growth, to become a grand person. And it doesn't mean to have to live a very long time, but it means to live in a very intense way. Even if life is a tragedy, there's nothing wrong with it. You can suffer in a great way as well, but it means to be a great human being. This is what the ancients put on the stage when having their tragedies. And this is something that always fascinated me. And of course, it is difficult because we are educated in a different way. We think life is nice when we are happy. But the ancients said life is good when it is intense. And this is something that really makes sense to me.
So, how do we need to change current society to live more alively, to have better lives?
Okay, bad news is it's very difficult. Good news is it is possible nevertheless. what you can see when observing this short span of history that is available to us through literature and through written texts. But there's one thing obvious, and this is that whenever change really occurred, it began within the mind of human beings. So mostly it had got to do something with religion. And even though it is a very odd idea, I suppose what is really required in our modern world is, let's say, first of all, a new consciousness for the religious dimension of life, and then a completely new kind of religion. But let me explain this. Religion derives from the Latin word religere, which means to reconnect. And humans need to reconnect with something that gives them the impression, or better, the conviction, that their life makes sense, that their life is meaningful. Not only the personal life, but life itself, that the universe is somehow meaningful. And that's something that gave humans the conviction that life is meaningful, used to be called a God. But we don't need to call it a God anymore. We only need to have that experience that there is something around us which is not produced by ourselves, which is not the result of our own subjective willpower, but which is simply real, which is there where we can reconnect to, and which allows us to make the world we're living in to become a good place, to be a home. So I think we need to learn to reconnect in a proper way, to reconnect with life, to reconnect with nature, to reconnect with being itself, very philosophically spoken. But this is exactly what I try to do in my personal work. And I want to convince people that life is easier and probably more fulfilling when we stop trying to do everything on the basis of our own power and our own ambition.
Now, you're off to connect to something greater than yourself today, aren't you? Because you're in Greece today. What are you off to do today?
After having done this beautiful conversation with you, Sue, I will go for a lovely hike somewhere out here in the mountains, where there is a beautiful ancient Greek temple dedicated to the god Apollo, who is my favorite one, close to the seaside. And I mean, these old temples and all about the landscape all around here is really a good surrounding in order to reconnect with life and with nature and with the beauty that is dwelling constantly around us.
I'm glad you're walking your own talk by reconnecting.
To be honest, I don't always do it, but today I'm going to do it, yes.
Well, I'm glad you do it sometimes. The whole sense I get from what you're describing to us today, Christoph, is our ability in a way to slow down and think and reflect in order to reconnect and change our perspective. I've added in the word slow down here. You didn't specifically mention that, but I innately sense that that's an important step for us all to be taking. Would you agree with me on the need for us to slow down?
Sure.
And if so, how do we do that, given that the world only just seems to be speeding up?
Yeah, that's true. I completely agree. And this process of speeding up is due to our economic mindset, which makes us believe that time is money and that saving time is important in order to make more money. And time has become a kind of a thing that we can consume, like we can consume everything else. And through this, we are constantly speeding up. That's true. And I think this is not good. And everybody knows that we need to slow down, because otherwise it is very hard to get deeper. You know, I always have the image of skating. You can move very quickly on a frozen lake. And the more you are afraid of breaking in and falling into the water, the quicker you will move. And this is a metaphor of the world we are living in. We are living in a very icy, frosty atmosphere. We constantly try to move in order to avoid standing still and avoiding the risk that we will suddenly dive into the sea, into the water, into our real existence and into our liveness. And I think this is problematic, because it is, to keep the metaphor, it is a pretty superficial life that we are leading in this way. We are constantly moving on the user surface of our own self without ever having the opportunity to reflect on who we are and to shed light onto our blind spots, as I mentioned before. Therefore, slowing down, standing still, taking our time to reflect is something which is pretty urgent, for otherwise real transformation and change is not possible.
I could speak to you all day, Christoph, but we do eventually have to come to a close. How do you take your own medicine, so to speak? I'm just wondering, in your career to date, what have been some of the most pivotal moments of epiphany that you have had along the way?
Well, again, it's all about conversation. And what I'm actually trying to do is to converse as much as possible. And my conversation partners are quite different. Partly it is nature. Therefore, what really gives me courage and strength is to dive into nature, to go hiking somewhere in the Alps or in Greece or wherever. The more nature, the more wilderness, the better it is. And the more I can rearrange my mind. Next comes a conversation with my clients, with those who applied to a philosophical journey. This is pretty inspiring for me because these are people coming from different professions. They have their different biographies, their different perspectives, and conversing with them on philosophical topics always is a source of inspiration. But next to this, however, I have my teachers, some people who had really become significant for me in the later past, for instance, Anglo-American poet David Whyte, from whom I learned quite a lot, or a shaman from Greenland called Angangak, with who I walked for a couple of years and I wrote 2 books for him. I have a shamanic coach as well, a good friend of mine who initiates me into completely new ways of thinking, which really fascinates me because through diving into the wisdom of shamanism, I realized that I can understand ancient Greek philosophy much better than I did before. Sometimes it seems to me that Plato on a mental level is far more similar with a Mongolian shaman than a university professor from Princeton. So I think there is so much wisdom in the world. And whenever I have the opportunity to find these wisdom keepers, I'm very eager to connect with them. And sometimes it's hard to get rid of me. But also with text, however, I mean, again and again, it happens to me, even though I read a couple of books, that I discover a new author who becomes a new source of inspiration for me. For instance, the German poet Hölderlin had been an infinite source of inspiration, and I'm very happy that I had the opportunity to read his works.
Wow, finding wisdom keepers. I love that. So my final question to you is a real pragmatic question, Christoph. If a listener has been intrigued by what you're saying and then they want to go and do something to take a step into this world of philosophy, what would be your practical advice to them?
Where there are no simple recipes. What really matters most in my understanding is to train yourself in an open attitude toward whatever occurs to you. So we usually have a kind of shield which protects us against the impact of the outer world. I would love to invite people to put that shield apart and to try to invite life to become an inspiring interlocutor which might help you to unfold your hidden potentials. It is a shift of attitude. This is all that philosophy can invite you to do. We have no mythology, we do not have a toolbox, we do not have a skill set. The only thing that we can do is inspire people to ask questions and to carefully listen to probable answers, even though you haven't questioned them before. This is what I would like to inspire our listeners to.
Wonderful. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, Christoph. I just love the way that you put words to many of the thoughts that I hold about the world and about how we can engage and learn from it. How can our listener find out more about you and the work that you do if they're equally intrigued?
Well, unfortunately, this is a bit difficult because the more than 50 books I've written are not translated to English, mostly at least. Therefore, it is a bit difficult. But I have LinkedIn address, and there I partly publish contributions, articles in English as well. And I have a webpage, my webpage, www.christophquarch.de. And lately, together with my wife and a bunch of colleagues, we founded the new Platonic Academy, Academy 3. We have a webpage in German and English as well. And there people can definitely find a bit of information about the things that I'm actually doing and probably some inspiration as well.
Wonderful. Well, we'll put links to those things on our show notes. Again, it's been a fantastic conversation, Christoph. I hope you've enjoyed it too.
I did so. It was really a pleasure to talk with you. And I realized that even though you haven't realized it so far, you are a philosopher as well. So it was really a philosophical conversation, and that's fun. And it was quite inspiring for me. Yes, even though sometimes I had a kind of problem to find the right words in English. But I think at the end of the day, I've done it. So thank you for inviting me.
I hope you've enjoyed what Christoph had to say today. It certainly got me thinking in a different way. If you'd like to share this episode with others so that they can also be inspired, we'd love you to do that. A simple way to do that is just to leave a review of the podcast on the podcasting platform that you've been listening to this on, and then that will encourage other people to listen as well. We really appreciate your support to reach new listeners. We shall be back very soon with our review of the year, sharing with you our favourite episodes from this last 12 months. I hope you can join us then.